Okay, so today's video is going to be about land banking, and it's a response to Formafist, who is a Canadian YouTuber who covers housing. So if you're interested, go check out his channel. It's spelled just how you see it here on the PowerPoint. And so land banking is the concept, I guess, of holding land, vacant land, with no plans to develop it. And his complaint in the video is about how property taxes are, I think he said in Canada, they're sometimes lower on vacant land than developed land, which enables this practice. And so his argument is that it's bad because it is shrinking the supply of available land to develop into housing, which then drives housing prices up and makes it more unaffordable for young people to own a home. So I'm going to kind of get into it, talk about where I agree with him, where I disagree with him, and see if we ever get some kind of response from him. All right, so property taxes are kind of the main thrust of this, right? Because we're talking about, should property taxes on vacant land be higher in order to discourage the practice of land banking? And so I'm going to start with just like a kind of pros and cons of property taxes. Okay, so here we go. First bullet point. So the obvious is that property taxes increase the cost of holding land. Now this has like several effects, some of them good, some of them bad, right? So the good thing, and this is kind of the whole pushback against land banking, is property taxes encourage people to develop land profitably, right? So if you have vacant land, possibly the only thing you can do with it is use it as a hunting ground or something, which, might bring in some income, but depending on the size and quality of the land, it may not bring in enough so to cover property taxes. Whereas if there weren't property taxes, you could hold, huge tracts of land indefinitely as long as you had the money to pay for them and you didn't want to free up that money to buy anything else, right? So with the property tax, people are going to be encouraged to sell off pieces of their land in order to pay for the property taxes or develop their land into something that creates profit, such as like an apartment complex that they can use to bring in rents that then cover that property tax, right? So that's a good thing about property tax, arguably, is it creates a motive for people to create profitable uses of land. Now, a negative of property taxes is at some level it's going to cause homelessness, right? At some level, there's going to be people on the margins who were at one time able to buy a house and then lost their ability to produce income and maybe had enough in savings to cover the lifestyle living in a house, except for that the property tax kind of pushes them over the edge to the point where they can't afford to keep the house, right? Or even they have no income at all, no savings, and they're willing to just live in this house with no electricity, no water, which would be fine because, there's no cost living in the house even as it's falling apart. But then the property tax puts them in a position where in order to live there at all, they have to cover this property tax, or the bank is going to foreclose on it, or whatever, the city is going to foreclose on it. So at some level, the property tax has an effect on homelessness, and I think that's kind of intuitive, so I'm not going to go into it anymore. Another pro and con of property tax, depending on whose perspective you're looking at, is that it's pretty much unavoidable. You can live in an apartment and pay rent instead of own property, but the landlord is going to pass on the property tax to you. You can live at a marina on a dock, but again, the marina is charging you a fee to live there, and so you're going to be paying for their property taxes through rent. The only way you can maybe avoid it is if you want to do like a van life kind of lifestyle and drive around and live in parking lots, right? So, which is fine. Not for me, not for most people, but it's a good way to get started in life, maybe save some money, and it allows for kind of free lifestyle. Anyways, not the subject of this video, so moving on. Here's maybe the cost of property taxes that Formafist has not considered, maybe, And so that would be the idea that these people who are holding huge tracts of vacant land with no plans to develop in the future maybe are thinking, or maybe know intuitively, that even though right now the use for that land is not high enough that they're willing to sell, they can anticipate that in the future there will be projects that their land could be used for which are of higher value to society than what can be done today, right? So I think the best example, best argument for this would be transportation projects, right? So in the United States, public transportation, or rather high-speed rail, is like non-existent. Only exists in California. We just adopted it here in Florida. Or not, it's not like a public policy, but a private company implemented high-speed rail in Florida, where there's maybe a little bit more vacant land than in California, for instance, or New England. Now, in California was possible. I think that's probably because between these huge cities you have a lot of deserts, right? But it's not profitable there because the cities are too far apart, San Francisco and LA, I think, for it to really be a reasonable way to travel or whatever. I think it's still more efficient just to go by plane. But where a lack of vacant land has proven to be a problem, let's see, I think I have it pulled up here, is in the Boston-Washington corridor, right? So, I don't know, I thought I pulled up a bigger version of this image, but I guess not. So this is Boston and Washington. It's kind of tilted at a 45-degree angle or so. So, like, if you look at a normal map, Boston's going to be over here, and then you're going to go kind of southwest. But here it's shown, it's been tilted to illustrate that you kind of have a straight line from Boston to Washington. And so that shows you kind of the efficiency or possibility of just a straight train track or highway that connects these areas, and the efficiency of it. And so along this line, I'll use my mouse to illustrate, you have all these major cities right in the line: Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington. These are all very large cities by US standards. Maybe Baltimore is a little bit smaller than these other ones, but it's still a significant city. You have several mid-sized cities here in Connecticut where you can maybe put like a high-speed rail stop. And you have population densities in this region that are higher than any other region of this size in the United States, and are comparable to like European or Asian population densities. I mean, maybe not quite as high as Asian population densities, but it's the highest in the US. It's definitely comparable to parts of Europe, like the Paris-Germany corridor. And it has the greatest potential to use high-speed rail because you have a high number of people living in wealthy urban areas which are interconnected and have business relationships and have the kind of need for faster transportation, reliable transportation. But the issue is there's no vacant land. It's totally developed all the way through this corridor, right? I mean, there's, I think, a pocket here in Connecticut that's mostly vacant. But for the most part, you have suburban developments where housing has been provided, right, by builders, but no land has been set aside for future projects. And I guess I'll point out, these are all high tax jurisdictions. I mean, back in the day, Connecticut was like a tax haven for New Yorkers, but at this point, it's one of the higher tax jurisdictions in the United States. I don't have all the numbers, but I would assume that property taxes are also a big component of the tax burden in all these states. And so those property taxes have encouraged people to develop all the vacant land in these high population density tracts. So it's caused a problem where in order to build some kind of high-speed rail, you would have to use eminent domain and have the government just steal all the land in this path and tear down the buildings in order to make it work, right? So this is kind of like the best argument against kind of prohibiting land banking or making it prohibitively expensive. All right, so I want to do another example on this topic. kind of beat this dead horse a little bit more. This is downtown Tallahassee that I got pulled up on Google Maps. I don't know. There's some tracts of vacant land in here, and I agree. I wish to some extent that they would just get developed now, and we could have more kind of housing options in the downtown area. But there's again, you could maybe argue that, look, if we develop this vacant land, and I can't find a tract right off the top of my head here, but sorry. Okay, so if we develop a vacant tract in downtown Tallahassee now into some kind of apartment building, we can't turn it into a train station later when gas prices reach $10 a gallon in the US or whatever, right? So there are reasons to have vacant land, and it does serve a function, even if it's at the expense of people in the present, but to the benefit of people in the future. And to the extent that you raise property taxes so that that calculation changes, you're going to shrink the amount of vacant land and maybe limit the amount of projects you have in the future without just tearing down a building completely or whatever. Okay, I think I've killed this slide. Oh, and then there's the other issue, the environment, right? So if you're an environmentalist, vacant land is a good thing, right? So you could, and low property taxes are a good thing. With a low property tax or no property tax, you can have nonprofits buy up huge tracts of land and just preserve it for animals or whatever, the endangered species in the area, which becomes more and more difficult with high property taxes. Then it becomes only a provision of the government, forcing only the government to be in charge of, maintaining wildlands. And you could say that's how it should be, that's how it shouldn't be. But, with low property taxes, maybe twice the opportunity of having large parks, which don't bring in any money because both public sector and private sector can do it. So there's that argument. So if not property taxes, then what? I think I'm just going to skip this because the video is going on a long time. Maybe a subject for another video. I'll just say sales tax would be what I would prefer. And then to answer the other question in the Formafist video, it was about deregulating, building codes. And yes, I'm in favor of it. I'm also going to point out another area where we should see deregulation, and that's parking policies. So a lot of, at least US towns, or almost all of them, require a certain amount of parking spots per, it depends. I guess if it's like an office space, it might be so many parking spots per square footage of building, or if it's an apartment building, it might be so many parking spots per unit. It just kind of depends on the town and how they do it, but it's a very common practice here in the United States. I don't know about Vancouver, where you are, Mr. Formafist, but I'm just going to kind of illustrate here in Tallahassee, right? We're in downtown Tallahassee, which is, the most urban, dense area, and we're just going to see, I'm going to randomly put my guy around and see if there's any spot where we don't see a parking lot. So here, we got a parking lot here behind these trees, and you just follow the mouse. We got another parking lot over here. All right. Okay, let's look at another section of downtown. Big parking lot, right? It looks like this might be part of a bank, but still, it's like another big parking lot. Parking lot. One building. So here you're at a downtown intersection. I guess this is a building too, but look at the ratio of developed area versus parking, right? It's like 10% maybe of this lot, and I don't know that this is necessarily one lot. It looks like it might be two. But look, I mean, you got this huge amount of land. Maybe 10% of it is actually being used for structure. It's crazy inefficient waste, and this is partly brought on by government regulations, right? They have this requirement that you need to have so many parking spots, and that kind of kills the ability for private companies to develop like private bus lines or private subways, because if there's this huge abundance of free parking that the government is forced into existence, then there's no reason to ride your bike, there's no reason to take the bus, you just drive your car. Whereas if parking conditions were tighter, you would maybe see a more diverse transportation infrastructure. And again, I'm not against parking lots if they're profitable, but that's maybe a topic for another video. And so I just want to, instead of getting into like, yes, I'm for housing heights, just kind of point out that parking issue. If you're interested, here's a book on the high cost of free parking. This is an excellent book. It's like 800 pages. I don't think you have to read the whole thing to get the point. But there's a lot of interesting gems in here. For instance, and I don't know if I dog-eared the page, but there was one point where it talked about how in California they allowed developers to, instead of complying with these parking regulations, which would require like 50% of their developed land to be parking instead of housing, because they needed parking for the tenants in the other half of the lot, they could pay a fee, right? And so I don't remember the actual number, so I'm just gonna kind of guess, but it was astronomical what they were willing to pay in order to develop more land. It was like they were willing to pay like $800,000 a spot or something in order to not have to have that parking spot. So, and I wish I had the actual number because it is astronomical. I don't know if I'm exaggerating it with that statement, but it was very high. And so it shows just how heavy a weight those parking spots are if people are willing to pay so much not to have to build them. But instead, in most cities, because I mean, this is just one city in California that allows people to do that. Instead, in most cities, the developers are forced to build those parking spots, and they're forced to then roll that into your rent. And we don't know exactly how much lower rents would be without those regulations, but I think it would be considerable based on the numbers in the book. So yeah, I'll leave a link to Formafist's original video. I'll leave a link to the book, and like, comment, and subscribe.